Welcome back to another deep dive. Today we're heading straight to the heart of Italy. We're diving into a language that people often mistake for just another Italian dialect, Venetian.
And we're going to break down exactly why that's a misconception.
Exactly. We've been looking at some excerpts from a text, and it really goes into the whole debate. Is Venetian simply a dialect, or is it its own language?
It's a debate that has even linguists going back and forth, to be honest.
Okay, so let's just get right into it. What we really want is by the end of this deep dive for you to be able to hold your own in a conversation about Venetian. You'll know exactly what makes it unique, where it's spoken all over the globe, and even why it matters, in the grand scheme of things.
I think a good starting point would be to address this whole dialect label that always seems to get attached to Venetian. I mean, geographically, sure, it makes some sense. Venetian is mainly spoken in the northeast of Italy. We're talking the Veneto region primarily. But language can't just be about geography, can it?
No, definitely not. It's got to be way more to it than just location, right?
Exactly. Venetian has actually developed, over a long time, its own distinct set of linguistic features. It's got its own grammar, a unique vocabulary. All these are really signs that it's evolved separately from standard Italian. We're talking over many, many centuries.
So how do we even start to kind of unravel this linguistic puzzle?
Well, I think a good place to start is by looking at what the linguistic authorities have to say. And this is actually where things get even more interesting, because there isn't just one school of thought when it comes to classifying Venetian within the whole Romance language family. You see, the Romance languages, at their core, they all descended from Latin.
Right, like Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian.
Exactly. But where Venetian fits into that family tree, well, that's the million-dollar question. We've got sources like Ethnologue and Glottolog. Now, these are really well-respected linguistic databases, and they group Venetian with Gallo-Italic languages.
Gallo-Italics, does that mean closer to French than Italian?
You got it. This classification is basically saying that Venetian has a closer relationship to languages spoken in northern Italy and even parts of France. But, and this is important, it's not a unanimous decision, not at all. We also have some very well-respected linguists like Devoto and Avolio. Even the Treccani Encyclopedia, they actually see Venetian as its own unique branch. And then you have the argument that Venetian has got some similarities with Italo-Dalmatian languages, like Istriot, for example. It's super interesting how one language can have all these different interpretations,
Yeah, it's like Venetian has a bit of an identity crisis or something, which, to be fair, is part of what makes it so interesting. And you know what else? Venetian has a past that's just as rich and captivating as, well, the city of Venice itself.
Oh, I completely agree. Its story goes way beyond just gondolas and canals.
Venetian, it wasn't just the language of everyday life. During the Venetian Republic, this was a major player on the world stage. Think about it. Venice was this maritime powerhouse, a center of trade, diplomacy for centuries. And Venetian, well, that was the language that everyone had to know. From merchants to ambassador, it even reached the status of a lingua franca.
And just to clarify for our listeners, lingua franca, that basically means a common language that people from different regions can use to communicate, especially in trade or business. So Venetian actually rising to that role during that era really says a lot about its influence.
For sure. And let's not forget about its influence on the arts. Venetian was the language for some of Italy's most famous playwrights. People like Carlo Goldoni, Carlo Gossi. Their comedic masterpieces, which are still performed all over the world today, were written in Venetian. These plays, they weren't just entertaining. They were like little windows into the heart of Venetian culture, They captured the wit and spirit of the people.
They really brought that Venetian world to life, the humor, the social dynamics. It's really unique perspective. And you know what? It's actually because of these works that Venetian still resonates with audiences today, even after all this time.
It really is amazing how this language, even with the standardization of Italian, still left such a mark. And you know what? That actually brings us to another really interesting point. Venetian's reach goes way beyond Italy's borders. It's a story of migration, cultural fusion, and how powerful language can be. But we'll dive into all that right after this. So we were talking about Venetian's global reach. I mean, it's one thing to be spoken, even in different dialects across Italy, But Venetian went international.
Oh, absolutely. It's a fascinating story, really. And you know what? It's a story that's really closely tied to migration. Think about it. Between the late 19th and mid 20th centuries, you had tons of Italians, including lots of Venetians, leaving their homeland, looking for better opportunities. They sailed across the ocean and they brought their language, their traditions, all of that with them.
And they didn't just like blend in and disappear. They actually built up these whole communities where Venetian just thrived.
Exactly. And today we see that legacy, you know. You have big, vibrant Venetian speaking communities in South America, places like Argentina and Brazil. And what's so fascinating is that they've managed to keep their heritage alive for, in some cases, generations.
So wait, you're telling me that, I don't know, somewhere in Brazil I could stumble upon a town where people are like hanging out, having espresso, and speaking a language with roots in the canals of Venice.
You absolutely could, yeah. There's actually a Venetian dialect in Brazil called Italian, and it's spoken by, get this, potentially up to 500,000 people.
Wow, that's incredible. Talk about the resilience of language and culture.
It really is. And hey, we can't forget about the Venetian community over in Mexico. There's actually a whole town there called Chipilo where people still speak a Venetian dialect. And we're talking pretty much unchanged since their ancestors came over from Italy.
Man, these stories about Venetian going global, it makes you realize that it's way more than just a dialect, right? It's this powerful symbol of heritage and connection for people all over the world. But even beyond all the travel, what I think really sets Venetian apart is its own unique character. Let's talk a bit about some of its, I don't know, grammatical quirks, the stuff that makes it so interesting for us word nerds.
You know, one of the things I find fascinating is how Venetian expresses the present tense. I mean, think about it. In English, we'd say, like, I am eating. But Venetian takes this slightly different approach with the phrase esedrio.
Okay, eserdrio. What's that mean, literally?
So it literally translates to be behind. So instead of saying, I am eating, a Venetian speaker would say something closer to, I am behind the action of eating.
Behind the action. That's definitely a different way of looking at it.
It really is. And it really speaks to this different way of, I don't know, conceptualizing an action that's happening right now. It's not just happening in the present. It's like you're actively a part of it, almost like you're moving along with the action itself.
It's wild how just this tiny little grammatical difference can tell you so much about the character of a language, like how its speakers see the world.
Exactly. And, you know, Venetian's got a few other quirks up its sleeve. For example, its use of what we call redundant subject pronouns.
Redundant pronouns. So using more pronouns than you actually need.
That's the gist of it, yeah. Basically, in Venetian, you'll often see a pronoun used before a verb, even when the verb ending already implies who the subject is. Might seem a bit unnecessary at first glance, I'll admit, but there's a method to the madness.
Okay, I was going to say, they've got to be there for a reason.
Oh yeah, they serve a really important purpose, actually. They add this extra layer of clarity, especially when you need to make a distinction between singular and plural, or even masculine and feminine subjects.
So it's all about being super precise, making sure the meaning's crystal clear.
You got it. Just another example of how Venetian, even in its quirks, really prioritizes clarity and nuance.
This is really making me appreciate the depth of this so-called dialect.
And, you know, we haven't even touched on its vocabulary, which is jam-packed with these amazing words, all with these fascinating origins.
Oh, okay. Hit me with some of these Venetian vocabulary gems.
Okay, let's start with a word you might hear pretty much every day in Venice. Un coqui, meaning today. Seems like a pretty simple word, right? But what's really cool about it is where it comes from. It's actually derived from the Latin hunc hodie, a pretty neat reminder of Venetian's Latin roots.
Like a little linguistic time capsule, like carrying a piece of ancient Rome into the present day.
You said it. Or how about the Venetian word for being bored? They say astiar.
Astiar, okay. Rolls right off the tongue.
It does, doesn't it? But here's the thing. Its etymology actually takes us all the way back to the Goths. It comes from their word haefts, which meant contest or even strife. So in a way, the word for being bored in Venetian has its roots in the idea of, like, conflict or competition.
Oh, that is pretty wild. Makes you wonder about the connection there between boredom and competition. Like maybe back then being bored was seen as some kind of internal struggle.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? It really shows how digging into the vocabulary of a language can lead to these unexpected connections and cultural insights.
Yeah, it's like each word has a whole story behind it, just waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. And then there's the word siapar, which just means to take in Venetian. Now, I know it might seem like just another word at first, but it's actually a good reminder that a lot of the words we associate with Italian actually come from other languages. Chiapar is a perfect example. Its origins are definitely non-Italian, showing just how many different linguistic influences have shaped Venetian over time.
It's incredible how Venetian, right there in Italy, has this whole tapestry of influences, Latin, Gothic, even traces of Greek from way back. And it's not just the vocabulary that's different. Venetian's got a pretty distinct sound, too, wouldn't you say?
Totally. I mean, its sound is a huge part of its charm. People often describe Venetian as having this really musical quality, but it's a different kind of musicality than what you find in Italian.
So how would you describe the sound of Venetian? Paint me a picture.
Okay, imagine a language that just flows effortlessly, where every syllable gets its moment. It doesn't rely on like strong accents or exaggerated tones like you might hear in other languages. Instead, it's got this lovely lilting cadence, almost hypnotic. It's like if you can imagine a gondola ride down a quiet canal, smooth and graceful.
It's interesting you mentioned that about the lack of strong accents. It's like Venetian expresses itself through these subtle shifts in tone and this like really consistent rhythm.
You got it. And unlike Italian, where you've got things like vowel length and consonant doubling that can make it sound a little more staccato, Venetian keeps things really even-keeled. It's like every syllable gets its time to shine, which really adds to that musicality.
Venetian sounds like a language that's meant to be savored,
Yeah.
appreciated for its subtle beauty. But with a language this fluid, this dynamic, I can only imagine how difficult it must have been to capture that in written form.
Oh, you're right about that. Venetian spelling, it's got a fascinating history reflecting, the language's evolution and all the different influences it's picked up along the way.
All right, so Venetian orthography, where do we even begin? So Venetian orthography, it sounds like we're about to enter a whole other world.
You could say that. You see, unlike Italian, which, had the benefit of being standardized over centuries, Venetian spelling was a bit more, shall we say, free-spirited.
A little less follow the rules and a little more go with the flow.
Exactly. For a long time, there wasn't really one right way to write Venetian. It would change from region to region, influenced by accents, by words borrowed from other languages, you name it. To really get it, we've got to take a little trip back to Old Venetian.
Okay, let's do it. Old Venetian spelling. What made it so different?
Well, for one thing, they use certain letters in ways that you just wouldn't see in standard Italian. Take the letter X, for example. Old Venetian, they used X all over the place to show sounds that just didn't exist in Italian. So you'd see it in words like Raxen for reason, or Crocs for cross, even Kasha for house.
So they were like okay with borrowing letters if it meant they could accurately write their own sounds.
Exactly. I mean, we might not know the exact way they pronounced X back then, but it's clear that they needed something to capture those sounds. Italian just wasn't cutting it.
Makes sense. They were being practical. So it wasn't about being different for the sake of it. They were just solving problems.
Exactly. And speaking of problem solving, we can't forget about the letter Z.
Oh, I'm sure Z has got a story.
Oh, it definitely does. Z in Venetian, that was a versatile letter. It could sound like, let's say, the Z in zoo, the D's in beds, or even the TH in then. Talk about a multitasker.
Wow. That must have been a nightmare for anyone trying to learn to write in Venetian.
You can imagine. And as if X and Z weren't enough, we've also got the curious case of the say.
Oh, okay, say. I'm intrigued. What did that one sound like?
Think of a sound somewhere between the S in sun and the yi-esh in chair. That's basically what Sayus was doing in Old Venetian. And, you guessed it, not a sound you'll find in standard Italian.
They were really set on doing their own thing, huh?
Right.
With all this variation, I can't even imagine how they ever standardize a spelling system.
It was no easy task, I'll tell you that. For a while there, people basically just tried to adapt Italian spelling rules, made it work as best they could. Like they'd use a double S for a really strong S sound, like bassa for low, and a single S for a softer, almost like a Z sound, like bassa for kisses. And they even tried to keep the X just at the start of words.
A little borrowing, a little rule making sounds like a real mix. What about the vowels, though? Any surprises there?
Yes. Venetian vowels a whole other story. You see, a lot like Italian, Venetian writing doesn't always show you the difference between long and short vowels, especially when they're not stressed. So all those little accent marks you might see, they could mean emphasis or a slightly different vowel. Really depends on who is writing and when.
Venetian spelling sounds like the Wild West for a good long while. So what about now, though? Anyone tried to, rein it in a bit? standardize things.
They have, and it's a really interesting chapter in Venetian's story. Over the past few decades, there's been this growing movement to actually create a unified, standardized spelling
It
system.
makes you wonder, how do you take a language that's been so free and make it fit into a system?
It took some really dedicated linguists and people who just love the language, really. They formed this group, the Academy of the Venetian Language, and in 2017, they made a big breakthrough.
Okay, I'm listening. What did they come up with?
They introduced a new system called GVIM, which stands for Modern International Venetian Spelling. And the cool thing about GVIM is that it takes all the best parts of traditional Venetian spelling, makes it more streamlined, easier to understand, especially for people who know Italian.
Like giving a classic car a modern engine. Still got that classic charm, but, runs a little smoother.
Perfect analogy. Like, they decided to go all in on using X for that distinctive Z sound we talked about. No more confusion with the regular S. They also cleared up how to use those accent marks, making pronunciation more consistent overall.
Sounds like they set things up for success.
Totally. And they didn't just stop there. They even put together this trilingual document, Italian, Venetian, and English, explaining the whole thing. Talk about dedication.
That's really amazing. It speaks to their passion, keeping this language alive and thriving.
It really does. And it just goes to show languages, they're not static, they change, they adapt. Sometimes they just completely defy categorization.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive here into this amazing world of Venetian, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I hope this deep dive has shown everyone that what we might sometimes brush off as just a dialect can actually be this treasure trove of history, of culture, of linguistic complexity. Venetian reminds us to not judge a book by its cover, to appreciate the unique beauty, the resilience of languages all over the world.
It's so true. Every language has a story to tell. And those stories, they're full of these unexpected twists and turns, these really cool surprises. Venetian, with its rich history, its unique features, how it's traveled the globe, it embodies that perfectly. So next time you hear someone call something just a dialect, remember Venetian. It might just inspire you to dig a little deeper, see what treasures you can uncover.